16th of the chapters uh, uh, the chapters meeting. We have the Moon Society, Tucson L-5, and the National Space Society here all today. We're presenting Andrew Chanin as a CEO of ProcureAM LLC, the issue of Procure Space ETF, and first global electronic traded fund to give investors pure play access to the expanding space of industry. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming out. Like I said, this is going to be a recorded session for archiving and for online. So we have Ron Nickel, who's going to be moderating the meeting. And just a quick review, if everybody could mute your mics while we're having our meeting, that would be great. We're going to utilize the chat to submit questions if you want to ask anything, so just put it in there. And we're going to do the talk first, and then we're going to have a question and answer session at the end. So some of the things that we have for announcements is the board meeting for NSS is going to be coming up. If you're a part of that, don't forget, well, I'm sure you guys don't forget that that's going to be happening. But there's also the voting for the board members. Don't forget that that's also been attached to your magazine. So there is a deadline for those to come in. You should have that all marked up on your ballots. If you have any questions about your ballot or you didn't receive your ballot, let me know. I'll be on the email so we can see about what we can do. They have a virtual ballot that I think they'll be able to send to you if there is a problem with your ballot. If you haven't already noticed, you've been getting emails about town halls every Thursday. There's one going on right now during the same time. We also have the NSS, Inside NSS platform that we're utilizing for National Space Society. That's a new platform for us to move forward. You'll be registering on Inside NSS to become a member or re-register for doing being a national member. Other than that, a couple of things that are going to be happening coming up would be the June 30th Asteroid Day. That's my favorite. July 1st, it's been scheduled that we have Chris Cassidy and Bob Beacon. They'll be doing a 7-hour spacewalk outside the space station. And then July 17th, there's supposed to be the NASA Mars 2020 rover launch to Mars. So that will be lifting off at the United Launch Alliance on Atlas V rocket from Cape Canaveral. So those are coming up. But otherwise, we're going to go ahead and I'd like to introduce Andrew again. He's described as ETF. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll take care of that. I've got
Perfect.
a full introduction for him. Andrew Chanin is the co-founder and CEO of ProcureAM. ProcureAM is an innovative exchange-traded product issuer that launched the world's first pure-play global space ETF called the Procure Space ETF under the ticker symbol of UFO in April of 2019. Mr. Chanin began his career in the financial services industry in 2007 at a time when electronically traded funds were new. He worked for the specialist firm Kellogg Group, quickly working his way up from clerk to leading market maker in the company by 2009. He was recruited by Cohen Capital Group to be director of international trading, where he helped to build out the firm's ETF trading capabilities. He made markets in several ETFs across a variety of asset classes. In 2012, Mr. Chanin created Pure Funds LLC, and while he was CEO between 2012 and 2017, Pure Funds captured over $1.5 billion in assets under management, most notably the Cybersecurity ETF, first of its kind covering cybersecurity, which grew to over $1 billion under management within 7 months, and that was using the ticker symbol HACK. In April of last year, he and his partner Bob Toll joined together to form ProcureAM LLC and created Procure Space ETF as an index fund following the S Network Space Index. And I'm sure Andrew will explain all that to us during his presentation. The Procure Space ETF is the first SEC-approved ETF focused on space commerce. The biggest cause for celebration is the effect that the ETF is set to have on global space commerce. Our Arizona L-5 chapters have long been looking forward to a shift away from an environment dominated by nation-state sovereign interests. While we celebrate billionaires pursuing personal aspirations and venture capitalists creating companies like Planet and OneWeb, among others, our hope and intention is to create an opportunity to develop space commerce in which everyone can participate. And now we have an ETF that enables anyone with a brokerage account to easily participate in the growing space economy. Beyond the immediate opportunities for investors, the ETF and its underlying index serve to help educate traditional investors, agencies within various governments, and space-related companies about the value of activity in space. This may change the way the United States and other nations approach the commercialization of space, leading them to consider how government involvement will need to include more private involvement. Andrew, I'd like to thank you for joining our little group tonight. I would like to acknowledge that you agreed to be on this Zoom call from New York City, so it's much later for you than most of us. We're pleased to welcome Andrew Chanin as the speaker for this month's chapter meeting. During his presentation, Andrew will discuss how everyday investors can gain access to the global space economy through UFO ETF, as well as his outlook on the industry moving forward. Andrew, it's all yours.
Well, first off, thank you everyone for having me and for joining us for tonight's conversation. And I'm certainly happy to keep this, even more so kind of a question and answer when people have them. And I've got the chat little dialogue box pulled up on my screen, so I'm happy to answer anything through that. But I'm just really excited to talk to everyone kind of about our company's vision for the space industry, how we see it. And I certainly hope to learn from all of y'all as well, and learning your perspectives as well. And so I started off my career in the exchange traded fund industry back in 2007. We noticed that there were a lot of new products being developed, and what I really kind of gained a passion for was creating thematic types of investments where people might want to invest in a specific theme, an industry, a technology, but getting kind of exposure to those industries were fairly difficult. Either you could invest in a very broad ranging technology fund and own a whole bunch of different companies doing everything across the technology industry, or you could try to pick individual names for companies. And that can be very difficult for many investors. It can be costly. It might be very time consuming to do the research to learn about the various companies involved. And ETFs essentially formed this vehicle for product innovation. And some of the earlier innovations for exchange traded funds were that it was essentially enabling any type of investor, whether institutional or retail, and it would essentially give them the opportunity to be able to get exposure to new asset classes that were historically reserved only for institutional investors. One great example was previously it was very difficult for people to get exposure to certain commodities like gold, and a gold ETF was created, and anyone with a brokerage account could invest in physical gold. And then we started seeing more and more kind of thematic and carved out areas. Many investors had difficulty getting exposure to international securities, and maybe were fairly limited to investing. If they wanted to invest abroad, they would have hoped to have found an ADR, or essentially a foreign company with a US listing, or use a mutual fund. And mutual funds have their own setbacks, such as certain tax structures, different fees for entering or exiting, like front load or back loaded products, things like that, very high management fees. And essentially the ETF has evolved today as a vehicle where many people can gain access to it, and they can cover all different types of areas and asset classes, be it global equity, domestic equity, fixed income, commodities, currencies, even leverage products. Certainly it's very important for anyone investing in any type of financial product to do their research and due diligence and read a fund's prospectus so that they know what they're actually investing in. But I found ETFs as a really interesting way for investors to get very easy access and instant diversification to specific themes, technologies, and industries. And when creating my latest company, Procure, with my partner Bob Tull, we wanted to bring out, like I've always done, a first to market type of product to give investors easy access and diverse exposure to a specific theme. And for us, we were most excited about creating the world's first pure play space ETF. And it's one of these things when you create an ETF where many companies that are in the space can launch a product, but it takes a lot of consideration and research and diligence to create it in a way that truly captures that specific theme. And too many times we see a company slap a name on a product, and then you actually look at what the index is holding, and it's not what that investor would actually want when trying to invest in that theme. So for us, one of the most important parts before launching the product was actually finding an index provider that would be able to develop this index that our fund would essentially track and try to mimic by making the same investments, that truly understood the space industry. And having seen several indexes proposed to us and not feeling comfortable using them, we finally came across S Network, which is a company I was very familiar with. My cousin, who's actually a business partner of mine, even used to work there. So it was a company that I knew well. And we were thrilled to learn that they had actually partnered with a company that was headed by a former director of the Space Foundation. And we learned that while he was at the Space Foundation, he was actually developing an index of publicly traded companies so that they could track the space industry. And eventually, due to their nonprofit status and trying to be an unbiased entity, they decided that maybe having an index that tracked companies in the financial markets and essentially had to select companies to add to it might lose some of their credibility as an unbiased entity, as well as potentially even harm their nonprofit tax status, and essentially allowed this director, Michael Walter Range, to go on his own with this research and try to develop a financial product. And so we were thrilled when we were finally able to meet Micah and go through the years of work that he had put into developing a space index, and really kind of learning how he developed it and taking our experience from having created many different types of ETF products in the past, as well as having been a trader in them, both from a market making side and a proprietary trading background as well, trying to make it so that the structure of the final product would be something that would be what we thought an interesting fit for people that A, wanted to get exposure to space, but B, people that wanted an efficient way to gain access to the industry through an ETF vehicle. So we really did a lot of kicking around the index to make sure that it included all different types of companies. But really what was very important to us was finding pure play space companies. And it's fairly difficult to build out a basket of pure play space companies from around the world, because a lot of the biggest players in the space industry tend to be some diversified aerospace and defense names, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. A lot of the large ones, Boeing, Lockheed, Airbus, and so on. There are several that get major government contracts as well as commercial contracts. But for us, it was very important to comprise this fund of not just the big companies who, yes, they are very important players, but we really thought that people that wanted to invest in the space industry wanted plenty of exposure to these pure play names. So one of the really neat details about the index is that it actually has a max capacity of 20% of the index can be allocated to these diversified aerospace and defense names that are major players, but maybe not a major percentage of their revenues are derived from space-related activities. So, Boeing, obviously, they've gotten a lot of press recently, some with some of their airliners having certain problems, and we didn't want something like that to be the major driver of how this fund would perform. So they fall into this diversified tranche, which in total can add up to 20% of the fund, while 80% more of the fund will be invested in these pure play names. So companies that are deriving at least 50% of their revenues from space-related activities and services. So what you'll see if you look at UFO and its holdings is you'll see a diversified basket with companies from around the world. Currently, roughly 30 companies. But one of the really neat things about an ETF is it's not just you buy the fund day one and it never changes and the shares stay the same. This is something that actually is rebalanced and reconstituted semi-annually and quarterly. So new companies that come into the industry that meet the certain thresholds required by the index and its methodology can be included into the fund. And so what someone that's investing in it gets the access to is a diversified global basket of funds. And as new companies come in that are pure play space names, they have the possibility of being added. Whereas additionally, companies that maybe spin off their space related business lines and no longer qualify, and they can be removed from the index as well. But it gives investors a fairly tax efficient and low cost way of getting exposure to these many different companies. So, after having the index created to a way that met our specific needs and beliefs, we were really excited to learn that the index actually received from the Space Foundation the first ever certification as the world's first certified space data product. So they recognize the importance of the index as a way to actually track this industry. And yes, we're excited to provide investors with exposure to space-related companies, but I believe personally that it's extremely important for people to understand what space is, how it affects our everyday life, because so many people just they hear space and they have just such wide-ranging ideas of what space is or how it affects their lives, or it's so far away they don't even think that it really affects their lives. They like to look at the stars or see space movies and entertainment, but that's where the understanding really ends. They don't understand that our smartphones wouldn't be working without space. Our communication systems, even our media and entertainment wouldn't be the same. Some people think that space is a dirty industry, and sending off tons of rockets create massive amounts of pollution and are affecting the environment. But at the same time, we wouldn't understand weather patterns like the way that we do. We wouldn't even understand how other types of industries are infecting our environment if it wasn't because of the satellites that have been sent into outer space. And these are all ways that people don't necessarily have a full understanding, but they're happy to take their Uber ride, not realizing how GPS is a satellite-based technology. And these are things that affect everyone's lives. And for me, I find it extremely important to educate as many people, whether they're going to invest in our fund or not. I believe that space is absolutely humankind's future. And for us to have an understanding and for us to be able to progress, the sooner we understand and get on board, the sooner we'll be able to achieve amazing things as a country, as individuals, as a society, as a global united force. The amount of things that we can do are just that much greater. And it's truly one of the most globally collaborative industries out there. So as you're all very aware, in the very early days, the space program, space was almost essentially funded entirely by governments and government space agencies. And we've really reached this new era where the commercialization of space has completely changed the playing field. And although it's fantastic that there are government contracts, which are roughly 20% or so of space funding today, because that really helps a lot of these companies get off the ground and have the ability to get government contracts to build out their technologies and do R&D that is critical. It's fantastic to see that space is now a very commercially viable industry for companies that can do it right and to do it economically. And as we see more breakthroughs, like we see with SpaceX and others building out reusable rockets, which can significantly lower the cost of sending things into space, the better technologies get, where sensors are more powerful and satellites are smaller and lighter, which allows them to be sent into space for significantly lower costs, end up being a phenomenal way for new companies to explore the realm of space and see if it could be commercially viable for them as well. So we're at a really interesting time where governments are there. They're still supporting the industry in many ways, but they're saying, we don't need to own, create, and operate every single piece of technology that we use. We're very happy to go to companies and say, hey, if you can help us achieve what we're trying to do, we are happy to pay you and give you a contract. If we want water on the moon, we don't need a patent and the technology to own it ourselves to provide that water. If you as a company could figure out how to provide water for our astronauts that are maybe building out a settlement on the moon, that's extremely important for us, and we're happy to let you do that. And it's this change of mentality that is allowing new opportunities for the space industry. And the toughest thing that we hear from more so the venture capital side and the angel investors in the space industry is that there are so many incredible companies, incredible ideas and technologies, but there's only so much money really going around and being invested into these companies. So many of them wither on the vine before they can actually see their technology brought to light. And typically what happens for many of these very, very early stage private companies is they start developing things and they run out of money. And as the company is being dissolved or in bankruptcy, one of the very big companies or the primes out there come and they gobble up those assets, and they either use it or they put it to the side, or they use it as a patent troll type of mechanism, and these technologies don't have the full ability to see the light of day, or it doesn't become a major priority for whoever ends up owning it. And so although our entire business is focused on the publicly traded, very large companies that are out there and have made it to their IPOs and beyond, educating more people about the space industry and discussing the importance of funding for these companies and showing them, hey, look, there are publicly traded companies. There's even a fund that's investing into these publicly traded companies. Hopefully that is a way that will encourage more entrepreneurs and investors to go forward and make the very important investments into these early stage space companies, because it's a shame anytime a great idea and great technology doesn't get to help people, because what we see with the space industry more than any other is that each incremental new advancement that we have benefits all the following companies, and that becomes the infrastructure that new technologies and new companies are built off of. And the ability to have a strong funding market for early stage, middle stage, and even late stage companies is going to be what it takes to really propel this industry forward, so that it doesn't need to rely as much as it still does on government funding. So that this to me has become something that was an industry that I wanted to create a fund around, that I was fascinated and was thrilled to create the first exchange traded fund to have pure play focus on the industry. But really it's now become a passion too, and I feel like we have the ability to speak to many different people than we would otherwise by having this publicly accessible fund, and being able to share different ideas and ways of collaboration, but also showing the importance of the technologies that exist today, as well as the many incredible goals that we as a human society wish to achieve. And we're still in very, very early days, but what we're seeing are some phenomenal changes for the industry. And we also see some things that maybe give people concern or make them question when we talk about things like the defense and the militarization of space. And these are areas that I think a lot of people have a lot of questions. I think most people don't want to see a hot war or any type of thing like that occur in outer space, and they want to see space as this open environment for great ideas and great people to be able to expand into. And that said, space is becoming the newest frontier for militarization. And certainly in the US, we've announced Space Force and Space Command. It's also extremely important for our national interests. So, secure communications, the ability to conduct surveillance, the ability to protect our satellites and to harden our defenses of our space-based assets are extremely important for our country and how it operates. But when the US is doing it, you better believe it's not happening in a vacuum. And China has aspirations, and India, and in Europe with the ESA, and even individual countries. Even France is creating their own space command. So this has the potential to be a hostile domain, but hopefully this is something where we can say, yes, building up, defenses and militarization could be, a strong catalyst for the space industry, but maybe our dollars could be better spent doing other things that are more of building out infrastructure and allowing us to colonize different areas that we either haven't been to before or that we've been to and we want to build permanent bases. And so there's a lot of conflicting opinions of what we should do and how we're going to do it. But it's very important, I think, that we do have these discussions, because if we let the governments of the world and the militaries of the world make all these decisions for us without us, being able to have a say and give ideas, then it will happen without a say. And being that it's so far away, you can't go to the moon and protest like you can necessarily protest here. And so I think it's an incredible opportunity for us to rally as a global population to spend wisely and try to make sure that humans are good ambassadors of planet Earth the further we go beyond our home planet. Some more near-term things that I think are very exciting for the space industry beyond potential militarization and defensive space are different technologies that people are investing in, and they are investing fortunes into them, not realizing that space is extremely important for those industries' success. So 5G, the Internet of Things and connected devices, blockchain, big data and machine learning, all these things people on Earth already understand how important they are to keep on pushing forward as a society. And what they don't seem to necessarily realize is that in order for, if all those technologies are going to work and be successful, there will be a tremendous amount of data either generated or being transferred from one point to another. And most people don't realize that satellites are a major important player for to enable those technologies. And so just like people don't understand how their Uber is picking them up, or how Google Maps is seeing where their friend's childhood home is on their computer screen, people don't understand the technologies working behind the scenes to help many of these critical infrastructure and technology plays being able to work and operate. So I'm thrilled that there's a group and very motivated people such as you all that are also doing the heavy lifting of both educating yourselves and educating each other, and working together to try to expand what we can do and the understanding and education of space. Because like you all, I'm sure, believe that without more education on the importance of space, not just how it affects our everyday lives already, but what it can do for society going forward, I think is absolutely critical. Those are some of the things I wanted to bring up, and I'm happy to open the forum to any questions as well.
I'd like to start that off with some background information. You mentioned Space Foundation several times. The Space Foundation was started by a group of members of the Houston L-5 Society back in the early 80s, I guess. And their purpose at the time was to gather a group of angel investors and see if they could identify businesses that could be started. Well, it was a little too early for that back then, and so they've evolved quite a bit. One of the things they're famous for is the X Prizes. That they were the ones that established the X Prizes and got a lot of the initial launch industry going through those types of events. They also do a certification for products. You received one of them as for the space certification. Things that are certified have to be directly related to the space program in either their creation or their utilization. And then the third major activity they are involved with is making sure that educational materials go out to school systems and teachers' resources and things like that. They were part of the group that started the Challenger school program. So I just wanted to tie back that the Space Foundation has been doing things for a long time, and they started with L-5. So got to be proud of that.
Fantastic.
When with the S network space index, I understand they reconstitute every 6 months. I'm not sure what that means. I do know that they've announced they're reconstituting this weekend. Right now they have 30 companies in it. On Monday they're going to have 31 companies. What does it mean to reconstitute an ETF?
Great. So I mentioned both reconstitution and rebalancing. So you create an index and you have your components in it, and on certain predetermined intervals, and every index has its own rules and methodologies. What they can do is rebalance and or reconstitute. So like you mentioned, there's this upcoming both it's a rebalance and reconstitution. So a reconstitution looks at the universe of publicly traded space companies. It looks at the companies that meet the various qualifications and thresholds based on the index's underlying methodology. And companies that now qualify have the ability to be added into the index. Companies that no longer qualify will be removed from the index. Whereas the rebalance, which also coincides with the reconstitutions, but also happens 2 additional times during the year, looks at all the positions of the companies, and it brings them back down to a reweighting based on both their market cap and also factored by their pure play revenues derived from the space industry. So if you just had it as a set it and forget it, you might wind up with a company that becomes 90% of your index. So this is a way to trim losses in or companies that have underperformed for their weighting to go back up, as well as companies that have outperformed for their weightings to come back down. But it essentially, with the reconstitution, it does that in addition to looking for new constituents to add and current constituents to remove based on certain factors.
Excellent. Okay. If anybody has questions, go ahead and unmute yourself. We've got a small enough group here that we can just interrupt. But looking at other activities that are going to be going on in the future, just from your perspective, Andrew, knowing the economy, what do you think is going to impact more or less? I'm thinking the Artemis program putting a base back on the moon in the next 5 years, or space mining. Is that something that's going to be coming up soon? And space tourism? What do you see as the big drivers for the next, say, 3 to 10 years? I don't know.
So if we're looking at a window of 3 to 10 years, and even over the next immediate time period, the communications industry seems to be one of the largest growth industries for space. And that is because these technologies, we already know how they'll be utilized on Earth. We already know what those goals are, how they will be implemented, and that is by launching additional satellites and ground equipment that utilizes this. Those industries that I mentioned before, cloud computing, 5G, connected devices and Internet of Things, but broadband internet and allowing people to access the internet from all corners of the planet appear to be one of the larger upcoming drivers for the space industry. Many people have differing opinions as far as the later time horizons, as 5 to 10 years, what some of these other major growth areas will be. I have an opinion that that actually the militarization and defense of space will become one of those next very large drivers. And the reason I see that happening, which is purely speculative and just my own personal opinion, and not an advice or recommendation, is that we are seeing military assets from all of the various military domains scaling up. And geopolitical tensions are running very high. And that said, we're seeing kind of the rejuvenation of international governmental space interests picking up from a point that I don't believe that has been seen since the initial space program and sending people to the moon. And I think what people are realizing right now is the importance of space. The reason it hasn't been colonized and permanent bases put on the moon is because it's been difficult and priorities have shifted focus. However, China has been very vocal about their ambitions of building a permanent lunar base. And if we don't have permanent structures as America have permanent structures up on the moon as well, there's not going to be any stopping what a country can do. So what's really happening is we're learning, and others sooner than others, is that the ability to build out your infrastructure today can have decades, if not centuries, lasting long implications for how that country will be positioned going forward off of this planet. Whether there's actually the immediate need to get there, I don't think matters as much anymore, because if one country does go there and start showing dominance, it may be too late for others to get to play nicely there. And so I think that this does become a game theory type of scenario where we will see countries spending incredible amounts of money to make sure that they're not left behind. And I do think that there is room for many countries to expand and to advance. That said, the countries that are building out the infrastructure first, just like most other industries, have a first mover advantage, and the stakes are so high and the opportunities are so large that not spending and not putting forward the technology and the infrastructure and the manpower to do it now would have immense implications down the road. So cyberspace was a major domain that the U.S. government realized the importance of expanding into, and just like they realize how important outer space is. And certainly I think that's an area that is also going to become critical, where we'll satellites in their early days we're sent to do one thing and programmed to do one thing only, and now satellites are reprogrammable and they can do many different functions. And although that's fantastic that the technology is there, it also creates that many more vulnerabilities. So the ability to harden space assets as well is, I think, another interesting industry where we haven't seen too much as far as nation states destabilizing space-based assets. But we've seen India show that they can shoot missiles at satellites, and we've seen all different technologies for satellite jamming. And the more that these are actually implemented and put into use, the more important it is to make sure that our assets are protected. And that might require sending up entire new fleets of satellites. So I think the other thing is, so we kind of talked about settling on the moon, but the same thing is with orbit. There's in low Earth orbit, there's only so much space, and the more things that go up creates more potential collisions and more potential debris, which could affect other space-based assets. So it does seem like there's only going to be able to be so many satellites that we can send up there at any given time. So it's almost like a land grab for companies that are looking to deploy satellites and put them into orbit. And all of these things are creating this game theory scenario where if you don't do something soon, someone else will, and you may miss the opportunity. As opposed to other industries where, well, I could just make a better car or a better version of that, where actually having that space carved out may be many, many times more important than even having the better technology to implement.
You mentioned China and India and the United States as being international players.
Russia
of course,
as
Russia
well.
has always been
Yes.
at the forefront. And I understand that France has also created a space command now, similar, well, different from what the United States is doing with our Space Force, but they are making a major commitment to military. And military and aerospace has always been, unfortunately, a chicken and egg type of thing that both of them push forward the same way. Lawrence Wynn, you had a question about garbage collection?
Yes, what about garbage collection as a business prospect?
Absolutely. I think it's phenomenal. I think the ability to clean up our space debris is absolutely critical. And we're lucky that we haven't seen more space debris and garbage flying around in orbit, because our ability to expand into that domain and build out infrastructure could be hindered so easily by space debris. And I've heard of many different companies, mostly smaller, kind of startup in nature companies working on solutions. Some trying to use sticky or metallic or magnetic types of aspects to lure. Some using net and meshed kind of based technologies to gather debris and to take it out of orbit. But one of the really interesting ideas that I had heard an individual saying that he was hoping to work on was finding a way to not only gather that debris, but figure out how to clean it and repurpose it and use it on other projects already in outer space. Because when you think about it, one of the most expensive processes for the International Space Station or for doing anything in space is actually getting items into outer space. The amount of fuel that is required to send anything into space is tremendous, and so you're limited to how many things you could send up on a regular basis. So actually being able to find objects that are no longer in operation, or they're just purely debris, and being able to utilize that for whether it's a lunar colony or an orbiting space station or beyond, is I think a really interesting way of looking at it. I mean, certainly we've learned about various 3D printing types of endeavors, which I think are also going to be extremely important for our ability to colonize and move beyond our planet. But certainly debris is one of these obstacles, and if we don't do something about it, we're just waiting for that problem. So unfortunately, no one has figured out the magic solution for it, and not all space debris is just created equal. So they all have different needs for how you can actually take them out of take them out of harm's way. But I certainly think that can be an industry that would be very important. The more that we build up infrastructure and the more items that could become targets, the more important it is. Certainly I'd love to see insurance companies working together to find some type of solution for that as well, because if they're able to figure out how to get debris out of there, the ability for them to create better insurance policies for their space related clients, they can do it a lot more economically as well. So I think it needs to be certainly we need the ideas, we need the technologies, but we need to collaborate. And I think we can get very creative by taking all the various stakeholders and those that have plenty to lose, and hopefully we can make better technology so we have less debris and things can be decommissioned and burn up upon reentry more safely and more predictably. But certainly, I think it's a huge area. It's one that we're not spending enough time focusing on, and definitely not spending enough money on investing into the R&D, because it's something that we could already be using today. And the longer we wait, the higher the risks are going to be for everyone.
So Andrew, I'm hearing that there are no publicly traded companies that do this or think about it.
There are companies that think about it, but they're not really doing anything on that.
There are very few publicly traded companies at this point, anywhere.
Anywhere in space, right?
Yeah.
But no one with a pure play focus, if that's the question.
Right.
Greg Rucker has his hand up.
Hey, staying on that theme, but putting it in terms of risk, I'm not sure of the public play companies that you've got in the ETF at the second. I was going to go and start looking for a second. But what would you say their major risk factors are? You mentioned insurance. Insurance, some people were getting out of the market this last year. I mean, is it government regulation risk? What is it debris? Is it orbital slots? What are the risk factors that are most critical, would you say, to the companies you've got under management?
Yeah, I think it's a wide range. I think you named a lot of them. The only one that I think maybe you didn't mention is the risk of competition from other players. And so we're certainly seeing a lot of private companies coming up and with goals of launching tens of thousands of satellites. When we're talking about fewer than 3,000 satellites currently in operation in orbit, you're talking about putting tens of thousands up there. The risk of competition, if they are successful and get government approval and access, and have the policy in place to send up fleets of satellites and mini sats, will other companies have the ability to then also send up their technologies? So I think that's a risk that's maybe less questioned by people. They just see that, that's an opportunity for a company to put their satellites up without necessarily thinking about how that will affect other companies to do what they'd like to do. That said, certainly governments could change. They could change the rules. Governments are known for changing the playing field when certain events happen, and it can certainly be unpredictable as well. But space debris has been something that we've been pretty lucky with. Collisions, we've been pretty fortunate with avoiding a lot of close calls, especially recently. But I think that government changing, and as well as if for some reason government contracts were going to a certain area of space technology and space companies, and they pulled out. That said, I think what we've seen is governments, even during the coronavirus crisis that we've seen today, it hasn't stopped the spending. And if anything, spending has, we've heard more budget going towards spending on space, which it should be encouraging for the broader space industry, that even though there are other distractions and maybe other pressing needs that could require money, that the government's happy to just print more. So I think maybe there's more of an issue with maybe currency devaluation from this, but the demand to push projects forward. Really, what we've seen from the coronavirus crisis is maybe projects get delayed, and projects getting delayed versus being shut down. I'd rather see something get delayed, but obviously you have certain windows with space where you don't want to send things into outer space at certain times of the year if you're trying, depending on where you're trying to send it, because it just becomes so much more expensive. It takes so much time based on varying orbits and whatnot, that you only have some certain limited windows, so you might need to push back even further than just waiting for coronavirus to dissipate. But my biggest fear certainly would be governments changing the rules and space debris.
So biggest fears are government and space debris at the second for the companies you're dealing with.
Yep.
And competition.
Yep, and competition, exactly.
Competition.
So, yep.
Well, staying on that theme a little bit, obviously you've got some larger companies you're dealing with here in Arizona, Vector. Let me rephrase back this up a little bit. In terms of the danger to a company, you're trading their stock. You've got them in the ETF form, but like Vector lost one of their investors and suddenly they're in trouble. Is there a danger in terms of ETF investments if to the companies that are in your pool that rebalancing or shifts in the ETF, if they're heavily committed in the ETF, is there a financial risk to the companies that are being traded by the ETF? I'm not saying that question well. Maybe
Can I add to that question just a little bit?
Hmm?
How does additional investments in your ETF affect the underlying companies that are in the index?
I mean, that, and then add to it, is there any downside risk for them to being listed in the ETF?
I think most companies, to my understanding, find being included in an ETF as a very positive development for them. There's many small companies that have reached out to me in the space industry as well as in other industries where I've created funds previously, cybersecurity, mobile payments, and so on. That would love to be included into the fund, because essentially, how does someone invest in their company otherwise? They need to find out about them. They need to be extremely interested, and they need to have the access and ability to even be able to invest in those companies. Whereas if they're included in the fund, every $1 that's invested into the ETF, a certain percentage based on their weighting is pro rata going into purchasing their stock. So they see us as, we're not, activist traders going in and telling their board and shaking them up. If they're in the index, we're owning their security. So I think the time that they are, disappointed is if a fund, and our fund is still early and too small to have much impact on that front. But if a fund gets to be extremely large and ends up having a massive position in a certain lesser held name or security, and all of a sudden that security no longer qualifies for inclusion, and the fund is required to dump its position on one of these rebalance or reconstitution time periods, well, then all of a sudden they may have lost a major shareholder. And so for them, that could be potentially a cascading effect for their stock. Whereas,
so they basically need to be a savvy. By the way, I meant to say thank you for doing this, by the way, not just speaking. Thank you for doing the fund.
I can't think of a more exciting and a needing industry to have a fund out there, because I truly think if we're able to raise a significant amount of assets into the fund, this will be something that other companies will be inspired by or encouraged by, seeing, hey, there is investment demand for this industry, and that might help them get investment. It might not be from us, because it might be a private company trying to raise capital, but they can go to VC and angel and even private equity companies and say, look, like there is some serious demand for investment in the space industry. And without this, I was talking to an early stage VC, which is almost more like an angel company. And she was telling me that there's basically 3 angel kind of focused, so very early stage investment focused space companies, or funds out there. And between the 3 of them, they have less than $50 million in assets to actually invest in these early stage companies. So, for them to be able to show, look, there is an exit strategy. There is, if we IPO, there is a fund that potentially might become a shareholder in us. They find it very encouraging as well, because it helps them tell their story. And it's really important that that these early stage companies can get the financing. And it's just been so difficult, where unless they win some really early in their development a major government contract, it's difficult for them to get off the ground. So I think most companies are actually encouraged, whereas if an activist shareholder comes in and buys up a huge stake, they might say, wow, they're going to try to kick the CEO off the board and shake this up and fire a bunch of employees to do X, Y, and Z. I think they see a passively managed ETF as a benefit to their company. And we've even heard of companies including in their quarterly earnings reports that they are a member or a holding in a certain ETF, because for them it shows, hey, look, see, we are a company, we are getting institutional coverage, and for them they use that almost as a badge of honor in some cases.
Phyllis has a question she'd like to pull in here.
Sure. I think like so many, just people that have an open mind and are interested by things, it's impossible to not be interested in space. I think, your earliest, many people's earliest memories that, are involved in space, it's looking at the stars. It's having, going to a planetarium when they're, in early, grade school, or going to certain museums and learning about, the universe. And some of those themes and concepts are way too abstract and advanced to make a young individual really understand or try to grasp. And I think even the most sophisticated minds have a hard time grasping and understanding the full complexities of the universe, because most of it we don't even know what's there. But I think entertainment was just a phenomenal kind of messenger for the unknown and the potential. I mean, you look at things like Star Trek and how early Star Trek is, and some of those ideas are things that we're actually seeing now developed into technologies. Maybe they don't look the same, maybe they're not called the same things, but these are ideas that seem so far-fetched, and wow, that's just amazing. To now you have handheld devices that can do so many different things. And so I certainly think the entertainment world was something that made me very fascinated by the space industry. And this, the more you learn about it, and different documentaries on the cosmos and the universe and things like that, I think are just so incredible, because it takes very complex things that people maybe would be intimidated to try to learn more, and it makes it more understandable. So I'm grateful for the educators out there that have taken kind of the passion and an interest in educating the next generations. But both of my parents were seniors in high school when when we first successfully sent people to the moon. And I know for their generations and those preceding and after that got to actually witness that, was an absolutely incredible thing in shaping many of the current astronauts and scientists that we have today that are focusing on this field. And now I'm just thrilled too that we're seeing things like the successful commercial space launches, sending people into outer space, and some of these exciting projects. And we just had the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing, and these are all things that are bringing so much more attention. You're seeing more media outlets covering it, whether it's financial news networks or it's internet-based websites that are showing these major events occurring. And it's bringing so much renewed excitement, energy, and new minds to the space. And I think what's really exciting to me is that they'll get to witness these incredible things happening, and hopefully that will inspire them to move to this industry as well, and create the next generation of incredible projects.
Anybody else have something you want to add? It looks like Lawrence had something added here. Did you want to ask another question, Lawrence?
I do. You spoke of frontiers earlier, and also the potential for government dominance to inhibit the formation of those frontiers by excluding others. I was just wondering, what have you given any thought to what exactly constitutes a frontier in general? What does space have to be to qualify as a frontier? I've heard things like resources without proprietors as a qualification, but are there others?
That's a really interesting way of putting that. I think a frontier is just somewhere that we haven't been able to fully grasp or explore or certainly colonize and develop. You look at the frontier used to be what was beyond beyond your campsite and your hunting grounds. Then the frontier became beyond where your civilization society was and where people push forward and crossing oceans and crossing continents. Just space is another one of these that has probably billions of layers of its own frontiers for us to go and to explore and to develop and share and learn. I think one of the things that's extremely different about space is the inhospitability of the different areas that we want to go to. It's difficult for us to do things at very high elevations. It's difficult for us as a species to do things very deep below sea level. But to have it very expensive for us to send resources to, and maybe not even have the resources that we need on that planet or on that moon, is a very incredible challenge. And the ability to not have a lifeline so nearby is something that I think is frightening. So I think fear of being alone or without the ability to come back to from the frontier to society is another thing that would potentially qualify that. Which is why I don't think it's necessarily an immediate mega driver for the industry, but in order for us to expand our capabilities and ability to survive in outer space in these situations is the building up of infrastructure, is the ability to go to the moon, go to Mars, go to an asteroid, and actually be able to find the resources there or very nearby that we as just humans need to survive, as opposed to bringing everything with us, being able to take what's there and utilize that to make life sustainable for us is incredibly important. And one of the neat things that I don't think people necessarily appreciate as much on Earth is they say, oh, we have so many problems here on Earth. Why are we spending time and focusing energy on going to trying to go to other planets and some very big goals such as that when they're starving on Earth and there's bad water on Earth. But you look at these things that we're trying to solve for if we want to send humans into outer space, and it's the same problems. It's making sure that we have drinkable water. It's making sure that we can create food sources and sustainable living. And it's quite possible that in our process of exploring for how humans can do that in outer space, we might find solutions that we can actually bring back to Earth. And that's something that I don't think people necessarily appreciate. And there's so many things that we can just go back and look at the early space program and see how that's actually impacted our lives on Earth, whether we realize it or not. And that's just another reason why it's so important for people to understand and to make these critical investments that early stage companies need, because although it might sound like it's a far-fetched idea that's only going to help a few finite amount of people in outer space, these are things that might be able to be used on Earth to bring water and food to people in remote areas where it's difficult to grow previously. So I think that's a really interesting area that isn't just for the benefit of space travelers, but could be extremely important for how societies grow in hostile environments on Earth today.
Phyllis is asking if you have an opinion on space tourism.
I think it's fantastic. You talk
How it will impact the economy of
Sure.
space.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems like the first, commercially viable space tourism business is looking like it will be Virgin Galactic. They're able to execute on their several goals. They are a large holding in UFO currently. So we were excited to see them be accessible for the public markets because we weren't able to invest in them until they were brought to the New York Stock Exchange. And it's very different than what I think space tourism, many people envision as space tourism, right? It's still very expensive. It's not the tens of millions of dollars it costs to send an astronaut to the ISS, but it's $250,000 is a lot of money, and not a lot of people are going to be able to afford to enjoy that experience. That said, the better the technology gets, the more people that go on it, the better they'll be able to build their technology out, hopefully, and hopefully lower those costs to give many more people that experience. Unfortunately, I think it's only going to give people a small taste of what they would ideally love to experience. And being able to spend days or weeks in outer space and look back and see our blue dot and get that appreciation for how small and interconnected our planet is. But every time you talk to an astronaut, they tell you, one of their favorite things is the new understanding and appreciation that they had for planet Earth. And I think the more people that can go up there and actually see how small of a place that we all come from and share, hopefully it will change mindsets, and those mindsets will hopefully change businesses and change the way we treat each other. And so I hope that's one of the earlier impacts. That said, I think space tourism has the potential to become a strong industry for the space industry. It's just difficult in the next several decades to imagine a space tourism industry that is affordable enough that a lot of people can do it, and so that it can actually get the revenues that it would actually need to be economically viable, to really have tremendous experiences. So some of the biggest companies are on this planet are selling band-aids and cotton balls and things like that are so ordinary. It's because they have so many customers and so many people buying them that they're huge businesses, and it's difficult to figure out how we're going to get costs significantly lower so that more people can actually experience that, to really have a huge driving force. So it does seem like space tourism, at least for the next several decades, it seems like it will be possible. I think some people will absolutely love the experience, but it will only get them wanting to experience more, and those next levels of experience, which would be actually going into orbit and spending time there, and as opposed to a couple minutes of low gravity experience and the ability to take a couple pictures or some YouTube videos or whatnot. I don't think that's the full experience that people want. So it's as close as we can do right now for the costs, and still have potentially an economically viable company doing it. But I think the really exciting thing is when you have a hotel on the moon, like like Hilton said that they wanted to do back in the day on and things like that. But the risks are also so high. So you have to think that people with tremendous amounts of money that can afford it will also weigh the risk reward of actually going there and being first. Certainly there's the vanity aspect of being able to say that you did something before everyone else, or the vanity aspect of being able to do something that few or no one else has been or will be able to do. But it's got to be a tremendous experience to really justify the costs that someone would need to put aside to actually do something beyond just a couple of minutes in low gravity.
Since you mentioned Richard Branson, I want to kind of summarize the philosophies of the three major billionaires. With Elon Musk, he has the commitment to do something phenomenal that will really get us into a new environment in space, and he's willing to risk everything he has for it, which is not something you would want in a for-profit capitalist environment. And so his business is not going to go public anytime soon. Whereas Bezos he basically has the L-5 philosophy. We're not going to go to the planets. We're going to build in space. We're going to have big colonies, and we're going to do it right the first time. So he's pouring his money into a system that really makes sure that you have the big infrastructure in place as early as possible, and then let somebody else figure out what to do with it. But again, that's not an approach that a capitalist would normally go to, because as soon as you get investors involved, they want return on investment. So he's doing the kind of thing you would expect the government to do, and governments just don't have enough focus for it. So he's providing that focus. Whereas Richard Branson has the attitude that he's not going to do anything unless he can make a profit on it, at least in a year or two. So his approach is to bring profitability in to the smallest little aspect of it. And I think all three of those approaches have real value, but the only one that's really going to be in the ETF is going to be Branson's approach because of the profitability.
We've definitely heard rumors of spinouts of some subsidiaries and properties of Elon Musk's SpaceX. So that could be a way that some areas get additional funding. But in order to do that, like you said, people are typically, when investing in the capital markets, are doing it not charitably. They do want to see a return, and like you said, that changes how businesses are operated. And I've certainly heard from others as well, the same belief of the various billionaires and their mindsets and strategies. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of firsts occur from SpaceX, where strong sustainable businesses maybe are built by Bezos, and I think that's certainly possible. I think what is incredible though is SpaceX's ability to get contracts, and they're getting contracts because there's immediate needs from companies and from governments that need his services, and if he's able to do it at a lower cost, lower the barriers of entry, I think that's in general a phenomenal thing for the space industry, because if we can get these costs lower, it allows for more people to get into outer space, for more companies to go there, to do R&D, to build, and all of these things could create the next wave of innovation in companies as well. So I think there is a place for all of them, and I certainly wish every one of them success, as long as they're doing it ethically and safely. I've certainly heard the same opinions expressed before, and don't disagree. It's tough to run a business, and it's tough to run a business when your goal of profitability is years down the road, and some people have the attention span of a split second for investing, and some have decades and decades. But usually most individuals don't have the luxury of having a 50 to 100 year time span for their investment.
Lawrence, did you have another question you wanted to throw in there?
Yeah, I did want to know if a company was satisfying a demand for virtual reality adventures in space, would it qualify for a space ETF?
So that ultimately would go back to the index committee to make that determination. My gut would say I probably shouldn't answer that question, but
maybe a conditional answer.
but if I had to guess, if it was virtual and there weren't space-based assets in place that were enabling that technology, it might be difficult. However, there could be ways that it could qualify. If there were real-time satellites in outer space getting imagery, giving you the images that you're then seeing on your VR headset, and you're able to, navigate in real time or reposition satellites and things like that by, looking in other directions. I mean, maybe it could qualify. It would ultimately come down to the index committee, which I'm not a part of. So, I'd be just purely guessing. So I'd say, it's possible, but, if it's, hey, here's a video game and, you just strap it onto your head and it's looking, it's a way to, experience space artificially. Probably not, but I wouldn't say no, because they're also, depending on how they develop the company, it could be possible.
Okay, good answer. Can I ask one more?
Please.
Go for it.
I don't have time, but one of the things I was thinking while you were speaking earlier about people objecting to the expenditure on space activities when we have so many problems on Earth to solve. I wonder if there's if you have any feelings or intuition or insights into whether many of those problems are in fact a result of our being unable to leave the Earth.
I would certainly think many problems stem from that, and I think that's a great way of putting it, because so many conflicts. I mean, it's not even just human nature; it's all animal nature and all organisms. When you have finite resources, you start to see conflict, and whether it's a species of predators in the African plains. You'll see the same species fighting with each other for turf wars, or you'll see other species fighting with other species for turf, and the ones that don't get those resources in many cases perish. And we haven't been able to see a time period on Earth where everyone is getting along. It's usually from all different conflicts, but usually comes down to desire to occupy land or access resources, and the ability for humans to have abundant resources beyond our planet is not only something that could alleviate the problems on Earth, but may become even more critical in the future. I hear a lot about ESG investing. If you're not familiar with that, that's environmental, social, and governance, similar to impact investing, where you're investing to make a change, or you're investing by putting your dollars into companies that are good stewards and showing that they're doing good things. I think that's all well and good, and there's billions, if not trillions, of dollars that are starting to go into these kind of ESG strategies. And that's great. I think we should be protecting our environment. It's the only planet we have, and we haven't been able to prove that we're successfully able to live sustainably beyond the Earth. That said, if we spend trillions and trillions of dollars trying to make the Earth perfect and we fail, we'll need an escape plan. So it would be short-sighted not to be working on something that could give us a backup plan, because right now we don't have one. So I think that's a great way of putting it, that the problems on Earth is that we're all stuck here, and we have to try to get along, but historically it's been difficult. So
I see Greg has his hand up again.
Great.
Coming back from your website, actually, it's funny. Earlier, Virgin got mentioned. I was curious. You've got a pretty safe mix of stocks on the site. I mean, Virgin, when you have like Virgin Galactic Holdings, I'm assuming that includes their European operation in England and all that. And it's not just the tourism. Is that the broader holding?
So there are all different, Branson Virgin properties, but essentially Virgin Galactic is comprised of the space tourism aspect, which is the home base is being built not too far from y'all in the desert, and sending people on these just several minute low gravity experiences. The other major area that they're working on is point-to-point hypersonic travel. But there is a common confusion that the Virgin Orbit property, which is a launch capability company. They believe that's the same. It's not actually. They're separate entities. So when people are looking at Virgin Galactic, it is predominantly the space tourism as well as the point-to-point hypersonic.
Right. So
technology.
you don't have that extra bit of risk sitting there. I mean, because it may be a decision. I mentioned Vector. Vector was very close to home here. I mean, they got their first major contract, military contract, and then suddenly, I mean, it all starts to come apart. I mean, so you're in a risky field. I mean, for Trump transitional companies. I mean, you've got a lot of safe bets in there, but some of them are wondering where's their future as a corporation going to be. So it's an interesting business you're in. I don't necessarily envy you trying to figure out which way to go. I mean, but you're not on the index committee. Maybe that's the only saving grace.
Well, so it's funny because I have tons of conversations with people from the financial community and financial media, and people say regardless of the fund that I've created, whether when I created the first cybersecurity ETFs and the first mobile payments ETFs and beyond, people say, oh well, isn't this company or this technology or this industry isn't it risky? And to me, I've always thought, well, just because something might have a certain level of risk doesn't necessarily mean that I want to avoid it. It means that I want to find a way to reduce that individual company risk. So if you're investing in just one company and that's your exposure to the industry, well, you're going to have a lot more risk or things that could potentially go wrong and sabotage that entire investment. Where I think that's why I've been so interested in the ETF structure, because it gives that instant diversification. There are currently roughly 30 companies, and there could be more. Or if horrible situations happen to the industry, there could be less. But putting all your eggs in one basket, is a very, very difficult way to play a newer technology or an industry. So I think that. For me, the only way that I think someone can get excited about investing in technology without taking on all the risk of putting all their eggs in one basket is to diversify. So I think
But that 5% or 5.33% or whatever, it is a substantial portion. I mean, like you said, you've got a substantial investment in Virgin, and it's probably going to be important.
Sure. Yep. And the way that we look at it is we hope that all of the companies that make it into the fund are successful and able to grow and give great returns to the investors and hence shareholders in our fund.
But like you said, you've capped at least at 6. At least at the second, 6% is your maximum exposure. I think that was OrbCom or something like that. But do you have a top amount you would commit? Like you said, you're rebalancing the fund, but is there I haven't gone through all of your materials. Is there a top limit you would where you would say we have to rebalance? Like you said, 90% would be insane to have all of your risk with one company at 90%. You ought to be reducing that for the.
I think usually you look to hope to see the top 10 holdings not much more than 50% of the fund at a high. That said, if a company is just having stellar performance over the period of a quarter, and the rest of the industry is lagging, a company could get very large over that time period as far as its percentage weighting in the fund. But that's why you do have those rebalance periods to pull things back each quarter.
I think it's important to point out too that the index fund, which is separate from the ETF, is a rules-based fund that they have a set of rules that you're not having subjective analysis to say we're going to have more of this one because we like it. It's more or less based on a set of rules that are defined in the prospectus and are implemented each quarter as during the rebalancing and the reconstitution.
So essentially, the way to look at it is the index is essentially a benchmark. So the index itself owns nothing. It's just various weightings. And so our fund, being that it tracks this index, our fund is seeking to mimic the index as closely as it can before fees and expenses. And so we don't get a benefit from trying to outperform or get clever with the actual holdings of our fund. Our goal is to try to mimic those holdings closely. So all the companies that get added and whatnot, we're looking to the index. So like you said, the index has its own methodology guide. It's rules based. It looks for companies that are below a certain minimum market cap do not get included. They could in the future if their market cap goes higher, but we're looking for companies at least in the several $100 million in market cap. We're looking for companies that trade at least $1 million daily value traded a day, and so that means if you have a $1 stock, it needs to trade at least 1 million times a day. And that's kind of a liquidity threshold, so that we're not moving the market too much if we're getting increasing or decreasing our position, because you don't want to have a tremendous amount of impact when doing so to the underlying companies. And then most importantly, I think, is the company's revenues derive from space related activities and services. So you could have a smaller company that's 100% pure play on space that has a larger weighting than a bigger company that has a lesser weighting derived directly from space revenues. And for us, that was something that's important, because if you just wanted to take companies that do things in space, it would probably look just like an aerospace and defense fund, which already exists and doesn't give you that much space exposure, and it would be filled with just Boeing at 10% and Lockheed at 10% and Northrop at 8% and so on. But what we wanted to do was have a fund whose success or failure was going to be based on companies being able to increase their revenues and percent revenues of their company from the space industry.
Anybody else that has questions you want to bring up? Go for it, Greg.
Hey, staying on this subject about a little bit, one of the things, we're here in Arizona. Arizona's got the military side. There's been some attempts to try and generate more on the commercial side. I guess the thing is, in terms of what would be helpful for your company, an organization like us or a state like Arizona. I mean, obviously, what you're trying to do is do investments, and you need companies that qualify. But I mean, aside from just companies that qualified, is there anything you've seen so far that environmentally needs to happen to help there be more companies for you to consider in your investment pool? And I'm not sure that's a good question at all. I mean, I think it's maybe got obvious answers, but is there anything that you see as barriers that NSS and other organizations should be fighting to help?
I want to throw in that I've been looking for a mutual fund that is space related for a little over a year, and apparently about the time I started looking, that's when you were creating your.
That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, for just your.
And I am now a proud owner of some of your shares. So
thank you.
So your existence is a good thing. I mean, but in terms of helping you to continue to exist, one of the things is promoting the fact that you exist should be something we ought to do and make sure people know about. But beyond just spreading word that you exist, what would you say might be helpful that these type of organizations like Mike Mikowski down there, he's AIAA, for example. I mean, they reach out to folks. There's the education people. I don't know. Is there any way to us as organizations can help you, or the state of Arizona could help you?
Yeah. First off, thank you for the interest in wanting to help us, and to you, Ron, and anyone else that is an investor. Thank you very much for the consideration and the investment. I think there's a lot of things to that question. So one, having more companies that are publicly traded, increases the potential universe for companies that we can be looking at. So that's something that I certainly see as a benefit, not just to us but to the industry. Having more potential companies out there that we can potentially add to the fund. For a thematic ETF, typically you don't want to have and can't have really less than 20 companies in it. So the more companies that you do have, the more diversified a fund could look. And for some people, they might not want as diversified as a fund. Some might. But many states, their pensions invest in different industries or ETFs even. And there was a
Funny you
women.
should say that. That's sort of where I'm going there. Okay.
Oh,
keep
really?
going.
Sure. No, well, there's even been pensions that have worked with ETF issuers to create specific funds, and some of these happen to be in the ESG space. There's an ETF, SHE, and it was a kind of a co-project done by an issuer and one or two pensions, where they wanted to put some of their pension investment dollars into investing in companies with a certain percentage of women in the C-suite and different high-level positions within the companies. So they looked at all different types of metrics of women in the workplace, and the companies that qualified were put into that, and the pension, I think, put something like $250 million into it day one on the launch of the fund. I mean, for us though, so much of it really is word of mouth. I can do a million interviews a day, and that's great, and it gets the word out. The best thing that I've ever seen for a fund though, and its ability to grow, is third parties, non-biased, don't have a stake in assets going up or down. Actually including in their research or reports or their articles, because when I'm out there promoting the fund, it's clear what my interests are. I'm hoping to raise assets and awareness for a product. When a third party writes something about it, it carries even just that much more weight. So I mean, I'd be thrilled to speak with many other chapters, because I think for us, ideally people that are interested in space are the first natural people that might want to invest in our product. And then the next big hurdle is finding all the people that don't understand why they would want to invest in it, and educating them on why it might make sense for them. So certainly the awareness is first and foremost, and being a smaller mainly family business, it's it's tougher than being a massive financial firm with a 200 person sales force walking into every office. But certainly I know Arizona is trying to make a big push to increase their involvement in the space industry. I know Texas is. I know Colorado is vying to try to become the center for the space force. And it could be big business for different states to up what they're doing to make themselves a more desirable location for space companies to want to grow. Certainly tax incentives for bringing space companies to your jurisdiction could be a way to bring in more companies. And then you're kind of battling against every other state to bring those businesses over. But kind of creating the infrastructure, creating the policy environment, and certainly having the educated population there that's, you know, understands the industry and is ready to get to work and help build some of these, you know, next wave of phenomenal companies, or help existing companies, you know, take it to the next level. I think are all things that would be great for the industry and great for the state.
Well, I think it's time we probably ought to wrap up. Thank you very much for joining us for this almost 2 hours now. Phyllis, is there anything you want to say before we stop the recording here?
No, I'm okay. I thank you again for coming to share your evening with us. It's been very, very enlightening. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you all. I truly appreciate it. It's an honor to get to speak with so many other people that are interested in the same industry and have you know, great ideas of what we can do to educate and to push the industry forward. And if I could be of help on your end, please let me know. And you know, I'd love to, you know, keep you know, posted on your progress. So please, you know, put me on any mailing lists that you'd have. And you know, if I could be of help on your end, please let me know.
Yeah, perfect. I'd love to have you part of our list. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.